Go for it.
Ubia gindi na okawa Jennifer Marley na vitewa kawe po na po hoge winge ota. Thank you again, everybody. I'm just going to jump right into it. So tonight I'll be speaking on the history of Pueblo Resistance, kind of starting with the Pueblo Revolt, and then I'm just going to kind of outline the history of Indigenous feminism and why it's relevant to Pueblo people and what Pueblo people's roles have been in it throughout history. So for those of you who read an article I wrote a couple years ago about the Pueblo Revolt, some of this might sound familiar, and then some of it might not. Far too often, the story of Popeye and the Pueblo Revolt is depoliticized, which is fascinating because watering down a successful anti-colonial rebellion takes effort, given its centrality to Pueblo existence today. Even Native people tend to think of the revolt of 1680 that stands alone in time, and words like revolutionary are seldom used to describe its leader, Popeye, and all those who fought in the revolt. But that's what they were, revolutionaries. What happened leading up to the revolt and what happened afterwards when the conquistadors returned are also seldom discussed. All those details play a key role in understanding why and how the revolt is relevant today. The first big misconception is that the violence inflicted upon Pueblo people was because of our refusal to convert to Catholicism. Although this is partially true, this narrative frames the conflict as simply a clash of cultures, a common myth used to describe first contact between Europeans and Indigenous people worldwide. The clash of cultures narrative holds that settlers and natives were unable to get along because their cultures were just too different, and the primary disagreement was religion and culture. Reducing first contact to a clash of cultures fails to acknowledge the true intention and goal of colonizers upon arrival, which was unrestricted access to territory, resources, and native bodies. When Spanish conquistadors made contact with the natives of the Southwest, they were looking to eliminate us, not to simply convert and enslave us, but to remove us from the land permanently. Considering the Spaniards were weak and hungry and on the verge of death upon making contact with Pueblo people for the first time, they didn't immediately descend upon us in a shower of violence. In fact, they begged for our help, and being the generous people we are, that's what they got. It was not long before their genocidal intentions were made clear, accompanying the unyielding raids, rape, and indiscriminate killing of Pueblo people, medicine people, women, and Two-Spirit people were the victims of especially heinous acts of torture, which included being burned alive, being eaten by dogs, and having the breasts of women cut off. In 1675, when hunts for tribal leaders and medicine people were in full swing, Popeye began organizing the most prominent revolution in Pueblo history. However, it's speculated that the revolt was being organized for far longer than that. In fact, the majority of the time, Pueblo people had been occupied by Spanish settlers. Decades before 1680, with Pueblo revolutionaries meeting under the cover of night and in the mountains when their access to move freely on their own land was policed and restricted, is when the Pueblo Revolt and how the Pueblo Revolt was organized. It's important to note here that the Pueblo Revolt did not occur spontaneously because people were fed up with the violence and oppression they were experiencing. This is another myth. This myth ignores the way we commonly understand the political development of such uprisings. At least 5 to 15 years or even more of intense organizing had to take place before the revolt could be successful. This kind of organizing required the support and participation of entire Pueblo communities, and most importantly, a common understanding of the social and political climate, which meant identifying a common enemy, the Spanish colonial regime. Taking into consideration the extreme material conditions that the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 arose from, it's not terribly complex to reach the common consensus that a full-blown revolution was needed, especially considering the fact that at the time, communal social structures were still intact, lessening the divisive attitude that is all too common in most Native communities today. Because of centuries of colonization, we live under conditions that our ancestors were looking to escape, and our disassociation from the true spirit of the Pueblo Revolt is the desired result of just that. In order to understand our present material conditions, we first need to understand that Pueblo communities have a deep and radical historical tradition of resistance. Our resistance was against empire. It was against settler colonialism. Yet the way New Mexico history is told today, it would have us believe that there was a consensus reached when the conquistadors returned, with cannons 12 years after they were pushed back to El Paso. This consensus was that Pueblo people welcomed back the brutal colonizers with open arms. The truth is that there was not the slightest bit of consent from Pueblo people upon the colonizers' return, because the Spanish would continue violence and killing unabated. After witnessing the power of a highly organized revolt, the Spaniards were willing to make slight concessions, most notably allowing ceremonies to continue if they were done to worship Catholic saints. A result of this was the creation of feast days. But there was nothing peaceful about the Second Coming, or what is popularly known as the bloodless reconquest. In the years that followed the return of the conquistadors, there was a massive expropriation of native lands and resources under the semi-feudal structure of land grants and peasant labor. As a result, the Spanish slave trading, which specifically was sex slavery, which is the basis for most of the economies of most cities and towns in northern New Mexico today, countless natives were detribalized because of this. The areas that are now present-day border towns so these people were detribalized because their tribal identities from one of the many native nations in the region, whether it be Comanche, Apache, Navajo, Ute, or Pueblo, were stripped from them as they took on Spanish surnames and became a landless population forced into slavery or ponage. These detribalized communities refer to themselves as Geniceros or Sequia communities now. Traditional customary practices of maintaining irrigation systems from Pueblo people influenced the formation of irrigation associations, which served as primary governing bodies in Genicero communities, shaping social structures within and between communities. The relationship between Pueblo people and the water, and subsequently Genicero people and the water, provides a way of understanding the class status of Pueblo people and Genicero people. Although the term Genicero was used to describe all included in the lower caste, it was meant to apply to people of Indian descent. It was primarily used as a class term, not a racial term, which is an important distinction. It was this detribalization of Native people that resulted in a new class of citizens, a class now capable of being bred white, and thus the birth of the imaginary Nuevo Mexicano identity is born. When Native identity is deemed something that can be diluted, the settler now has a pathway to becoming the dominating class and race. The Hispanic or Spanish American racial identity was a fiction created to make New Mexico appear white enough to join the United States. Those conceptions of Nuevo Mexicanos did not exist before that. Since both identities privileged a European or Spanish heritage, even if the population was mixed or descended from detribalized people, New Mexico's statehood was delayed until 1912 because white Anglos felt the territory did not possess a white majority. So a new race of whites had to be created, hence the Hispano identity we know today. The standards for Native and Hispano identity were literally created to uphold an ideology, a logic of elimination, the elimination of Native peoples in this area and the violent histories of Spanish slavery as well as brutal American occupation. Prior to this, the stronghold of U.S. entrepreneurs when they were first settling, coming in through northern New Mexico, took effect, the stark class inequality became more apparent, and this led land-based peoples, both Pueblos and Genicero people, to strengthen their relationship on a basis of class as people who were having their land stolen by U.S. settlers. This would spawn into two prominent rebellions carried out by poor Pueblo people, Apaches, Mexicans, and Geniceros in the Tewa Basin. These rebellions are dismissed in New Mexico history and almost always completely left out of our narratives around land and kinship amongst the inhabitants of northern New Mexico. The poor of northern New Mexico would rally around class and named both Spanish elites and U.S. elites with the American Party as enemies. During the revolt of 1837, Tewas and Geniceros issued a proclamation to the national Mexican government in response to a new tax program. New Mexico Governor Perez assembled a force to put down the rebellion, but they were pushed back to Santa Fe after his staff were captured and executed by rebels. So well into the 1830s, Pueblo people were not afraid to execute settlers. That was not that long ago.
5 minutes, Jen.
All right. Oh, geez. Okay, just 10 years later in 1847, another revolt took place. This is commonly known as the Taos Rebellion. At this time, over 1,000 Pueblo, Mexican, Geneseo, and Apache rebels killed the U.S.-installed Governor Charles Bent, along with others from the American Party. So I just wanted to emphasize that these revolts continued well into the time that I know my great-grandma was alive, on the basis of class, and blatantly identified the U.S. and Spanish governments as enemies. So I'm just going to skip ahead because I'm running out of time, and I'm going to talk about the history of indigenous feminisms. Indigenous feminism, as it's described in our key terms in our manifesto, is intersectional theory and practice of decolonial feminism that directly challenges settler colonialism, capitalism, and Western concepts of gender and sexuality. Indigenous feminist theory is critical of mainstream, or as scholar Sandy Grant terms it, white stream feminism. Mainstream feminist theory has long been critiqued by feminists of color for its lack of intersectionality and ultimate goal of getting a seat at the man's table, acquiring power reserved for cisgender heterosexual men, and diversifying the oppressor with more women being represented, rather than looking to abolish these institutions. Scholar Sandy Grant analyzes the role of moral reformers in her book, Red Pedagogy. And so basically what happened is in the early 20th century, moral reformers who were actually instilled by the CIA, who served a religious sect, were primarily white women who were sent into these pueblos with the goal of reforming behavior. They promoted patriarchal family structures in the name of an early kind of white feminism. They called for the abolition of religious ceremonies and forced Protestant morality, all while using Pueblo women as domestic laborers. And although this is a failed project, it still inflicted serious harm, not only devastating individual women, but entire families and tribal communities. So just to be clear, the role of white women here who branded themselves as feminists created massive damage, and we can look to the moral reformers for evidence of that. Lenape scholar Joanne Barker asserts that indigenous feminisms are predicated on two assumptions. One, that indigenous life matters. Two, that feminism cannot mean the same thing as its liberal feminist modes of analysis and organizing that have failed, even unwittingly, to undo imperial logics. So that's the difference between indigenous feminisms and mainstream feminism or white feminism, is that indigenous feminist theory seeks to undo imperial logics always. And it also demands back land.
2 minutes.
There was an inherent understanding that matrilineal structures operated contrary to the logics of U.S. empire and thus posed a threat to continued white settler expansion to the southwest. The use of Pueblo women as domestic laborers by Anglo patrons recreated a class dynamic between colonizer and colonized that had long been used as a tactic of domination by the Spanish. In this case, the policing of Pueblo women's bodies and the diminishment of traditional kinship structures was done in the name of assimilation. One of the more extreme examples of this manifestation of toxic traditionalism is seen with Santa Clara versus Martinez, which I'm just going to talk about this real briefly, then I'm done. So ironically, the Santa Clara versus Martinez court case was carried out in the name of cultural preservation of Pueblo sovereignty, though this actually ultimately upheld gendered violence and the logic of settler colonial domination within U.S. Native relationships. Barker reminds us how critiques of heteropatriarchy, how critiques of feminism can often be taken up by Native men and yielded against Native women, both within activism and tribal government. So when we're critiquing feminism, when we're critiquing mainstream feminism that centers white women, sometimes that's taken up to make anti-feminist movements on the part of Native men to suppress indigenous feminist manifestations. Various tribal governments use indigenous women's critique of feminism to suppress accountability for their own gendered and sexist politics and to silence indigenous women who criticize them for sexism, homophobia, interpersonal violence, and abuse. Officials made uncontextualized historical claims about indigenous cultures that dismissed their need to address gender and sexuality, representing feminism as superfluous. Yes. and and equality rights as irrelevant. For instance, the elected officials and some traditional leaders of the Santa Clara Pueblo insisted before the U.S. Supreme Court in Santa Clara versus Martinez that the Pueblos were a patriarchal society and that consequently their patrilineal requirements for membership were historically consistent. Santa Clara officials dismissed Martinez's allegations of discrimination on the basis of gender as culturally uninformed. These claims deflected the serious legal and ethical implications of their attitudes and behavior about gender and sexuality onto indigenous women who were represented as being either with or against Pueblo men, for or against sovereignty, loyal, traditionalist, or treacherous sellouts. These assertions negated the relevance of indigenous epistemologies, gender and sexuality, and the sexist and homophobic violence and discrimination within indigenous communities, thereby reinforcing relations of power and knowledge between men and women as articulated within social formations of U.S. imperialism. And just in case y'all missed it, Santa Clara versus Martinez is about Miss Martinez of Santa Clara Pueblo being denied housing because her partner whom she had children with was non-Indian. Nevertheless, this was also a performance within the courts of the conqueror for non-native courts to weigh in on Pueblo sovereignty. In contrast to the claims by Santa Clara officials, Barker goes on to cite Laguna Pueblo scholar Polygon Allen, who is often credited with writing one of the very first explicitly American Indian feminist books, The Sacred Hoop. So one of the very first indigenous feminists was a Pueblo woman. And people don't remember that history. So I'm just going to read this quote and wrap up. Gun Allen says, situated this analysis within a critique of U.S. patriarchal colonialism's attempts to destroy indigenous societies for being women-centered. Societies that she defined as gynocentric, which I have critiques of now. Things were turfy back then. Anyways, these attempts, she argued, specifically included genocide, land dispossession, and forced assimilation programs aimed at undermining women's roles and responsibilities within their nations and territories, while also eroding the cultural histories that figured those roles and responsibilities. Further, Allen contributed to understandings of the co-production of gender and sexuality in imperial and colonial social formations. She argued that imperialist colonists aimed at converting indigenous peoples not only into their religious capitalist worldviews, but also to the sexist and homophobic ideologies and practices as strategy for military conquest and capitalist expansion. She maintained that sustained sexual violence, particularly against indigenous women and children, enabled and maintained colonial conquest and was constitutive of the state that resulted. So, the Pueblo Feminist Caucus claims all the scholars referenced in this as belonging to, or we claim them as those who came before us in creating this tradition of Pueblo feminist resistance. And it's just really important that we as Pueblo people now take this work up and analyze it and make it our own, formulate our own weapons with this theory that has been thought through by non-Pueblo feminist scholars. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, when the logics of imperialism are taken up, the result is the formation of new kin structures that disown individuals and even entire Pueblo nations who fail to meet the authenticity that is only found in an unattainable past. Kinship is then distorted to assist the destruction of native nations rather than building and strengthening them. So I'm gonna end there.